Well, this strip of cloth told me that it needed to be a lobster, so a lobster it's going to become. And the way that I'm going to make this lobster is I'm going to cut an oval for the body. There's going to be a little bit of that fantail at the bottom and a couple of large claws and then some small legs and other bits. So let's see how that works in cloth, shall we? I've cut up my oval body there out of the striped fabric, and I really wanted to have a second chance to show you how this open chain stitch works. So come up on your cloth and you go back in a little bit away, just as if you were going to be making a fly stitch, but instead of taking one securing stitch, you really need two stitches. You bring your needle up so it hooks that loop there, and then you take it back in on the other side and then again come up inside the loop, but then you move your needle over to the other side to go back in. And you just keep going. Your needle comes up on one side, goes down on the other side, both inside the loop. So it comes up inside the loop, and now it's going to go down on the other side of that loop there to make a wide ladder-like stitch. And this time I'm getting a little narrower, so I'm just going to make this one into a regular old fly stitch there and secure it off. Do you see that? And that's the stitch that I'm going to do across the body of my lobster to give that impression of the plates that they have on the lobster. And that was what I was doing on the shrimp as well, but it's a little bit hard to see on the actual fabric. It's easier to see when it's a little bit larger and a little bit more contrasting colors. So you see what I'm doing? I'm coming up inside the loop there, and then it is fiddly, so lots of things get in the way. And then I'm going to go down into the cloth inside the loop on the other side of the lobster body there. And I'll turn it around. It's easier if it's turned around, perhaps. Yes, for me. So I'm going back in on the other side. I'm going to come up on the same side I just went in, inside the loop. And then I'm going to go down on the other side of my lobster body there. So you're alternating which side you come up and go down each time. Come up inside the loop, go to the other side, turn it around. It's easier for me to sort this out when I turn it around. And you need to leave that loop quite loose. If you pull it too tightly, it doesn't quite work. Obviously not too loose. You don't want it to be floppy, but you want it to be loose enough that things aren't pulling together. And at the end, I did just a regular old fly stitch. And then I went straight into doing the chain stitches at the bottom to make that little frilly tail that at the end of the lobster there. And if I had used more strands of thread here, I probably could have filled these chain stitches in, but they're not completely filled in, so I can go back and add another row right on top of the first row to make this tail a little bit more full and a little bit less transparent. But it doesn't really matter that much. I think it gives the impression of a lobster tail really quite well. It's basically just part of a lazy daisy stitch. Instead of going all the way around in a circle, I'm just doing part of it, so it's more of a fan shape. And I kind of messed up there at one point, and I did a blanket stitch instead of a chain stitch, but I didn't worry about it. I'm just going to go over it and just fill this in a little bit more and sort of go over some of the open areas with some straight stitches to fill things in to make it a little bit more dense. And then, yeah, no one's going to notice. When I think about how many thousands and thousands and thousands of stitches there are in this scroll right now, this is the part that that I'm focusing on the most, but no one else is ever going to look at this as closely as I am as I'm stitching it. They're going to see this huge long scroll and just see the overall effect. And so now once I've felt like I've done enough work on the bottom of the tail there, I'm going into the smaller legs, the smaller limbs that I have, and they're not straight, they're bent. I'm going to make, you could make them straight if you wanted to, but I'm making them bent. But I felt like just one of the straight stitches was not bulky enough and didn't really show up well enough, so I'm doing 2 or 3 of them till I feel like that first joint of the leg is as big as I want it to be, and that's a personal decision. I think I did it 3 times with 2 strands of thread, and then I did the second part of the joint, so it's kind of an L shape there. And I think they have 4 of these. I'm not really sure, 3 or 4. I'm almost out of thread here. I'm just going to do as many as I can until I run out of thread. And if you're wondering what's going on with my hand there, it's not actually peeling. Well, it is peeling, but it's peeling glue. I was doing some other art this morning and I got some glue on my hand. And I did wash them, but I didn't get it all off, obviously. And now that I've run out of thread, I'm going to take this chance to now cut out the claws, the 2 big claws that the lobster has, out of this other fabric that is a similar color, but not exactly. It doesn't all have to be exactly the same color. I notice the second claw that I'm cutting out is slightly bigger than the other one. So I'm going to trim it down a little bit to give it a better shape. And that's a nice thing. If you start out cutting things a little bit big, you can trim them down. But if you cut them too small, then it's hard to make them bigger. They're not exactly the same color, and I thought that the lighter color one would look better against the darker background, and the darker one better against the lighter background. So I switched them over. I've rethreaded my needle, and I'm going back in and finishing up on the legs here before I go up to the claws at the top there. And the funny thing is, when I started off, I decided not to cut out those little claws right at the beginning to prevent them from going missing as I was stitching. But then I decided to cut them out and do some more stitching anyway, and let's see if I can find them when I need them. Because I don't know, they tend to just sort of disappear, those little bits of things. I didn't secure the body on all the way around when I was doing that open chain stitch, so I'm adding a little bit more stitches to sew that on. And now I'm adding the stalk that the big claw is going to go out to, and oh, good, I was able to find it. I'm glad that it had not completely disappeared. And now I'm just going to go around the claw and secure it on just with some straight stitches or a whip stitch just around and around the edge. And I've just made an oval because my pieces are so teeny tiny that I thought that cutting out the opening would just be too much for these little pieces of cloth. But I can always go in and add those lines that make it look split later on if I feel like it needs it. I can use a darker color thread, maybe a dark brown like I did with crab claw, and make it look like a split claw, but it doesn't necessarily need it, because there again, mine are so tiny that it's not really that noticeable. I think as long as it reads as a lobster or a crayfish, then that's good enough for me. And it'll depend on how much time I want to spend on it. And when I get all the way back around the claw, then I'm going to beef up the stalk that's holding on to it a little bit more, add some more substance. And again, it's just really a personal decision how much. If you think it looks a little flimsy, add a little bit more. If you think it looks big enough, then don't worry about it. Keep going. And my lobster is very organic. I'm not really planning it. I don't want it to look stiff. It's swimming off at an angle, so swimming away from the turtle that's chasing it behind, if you want a story there. And I'm filling in a few more stitches on the body there to make sure that the whole thing is secured down before creating the next stalk for the other claw. And because I haven't got a plan or anything mapped out, I just start stitching, and wherever the stitches end up, that's where my claw is going to be. And it gives you a very organic sort of a lot of motion rather than being stiff and very upright. It sort of it gives you the appearance that this is just sort of a moment in time as the lobster was swimming along. And now I realize that my claws are not exactly the same size. This darker one is slightly bigger than the other one. And that also is not something that I'm going to worry about, because if I were drawing a lobster and I wanted it to look like one of the claws was a little bit further away, so it was diving into the scene, and one of the claws is higher up, closer to us, and one of them is a little bit further away, then I would absolutely draw one of them larger. It's a technique that artists call foreshortening, where things that are coming towards you look bigger and the things that are moving away from you look smaller. So who's to say this lobster has both of its claws sort of in an even plane? Maybe one of them's diving into the water and one of them's reaching out of the water. So those things are not important if you're making a piece of art. If you're trying to make a very precise, even pattern that in a craft type situation, or even in an art situation, there will be times where you want things to be really regular and precise, but this is not one of them. If what you're doing is trying to mimic life, you're trying to mimic something that's a natural object, then it's not going to be stiff and exactly symmetrical. So yeah, letting go of all of those ideas that we've been told over our lifetime is a big deal. It's hard to do, isn't it? I know I hear those messages coming up all the time that this is not this is not right. It's not looking good. But if I can just let it go and tell myself that it doesn't have to look good at every stage along the way, that as long as it looks good in the end, all is good. And now I've got some more thread on my needle, so I'm going back in and doing some more work on those legs on the one side of the body, and then I'll have to go back on the other side of the body and do the same thing. And now there'll be the same number of legs, and they'll be approximately in the same place, and I don't really even know if all of these limbs are the right number or in exactly the right place that they would be on an actual lobster. And if you wanted to, you can certainly go and check out a picture of an actual lobster and find out where these limbs should be. But I think as long as it reads as a lobster and somebody looking at it would identify it as a lobster, it's all good. So again, the bent legs on the other side, using as many stitches as I feel like I need to, either right on top of each other or right beside each other, to make things look as bulky as I like. And typically things that are close, the part of the leg that is closer to the body will be thicker than the part that's further away. So I'm keeping that in mind. So I'm doing 2 or 3 stitches on the first part of the leg that's close to the body, and usually just 1 stitch for the second part after the joint. And then that makes it look like it's tapering to get narrower as it moves further away from the body, just kind of like the way our limbs are. Our arms or our legs are more substantial where they're closer to our torso, and then narrower as they get further away, right? Yeah, that's the way tree limbs work the same way. The part of the tree branches that are closest to the trunk are the biggest, and then they get smaller as they move away. And there's the finished lobster. I think it's quite cute myself. And I hope you enjoyed it, and happy stitching. I have one more video for this month, and that will be a turtle.